Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Rick Dacey, Senior Minister, Wesley Congregational Life.
What would it take for you to get into a fragile wooden boat and set across the open sea? What would it take for you to get in that boat? For Paul, it took a vision. For Paul and his team, it took a vision. A vision in a dream of a man in Macedonia standing and begging, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." We see that in Acts 16:9. And in leading up to the passage that we read tonight, we really need to see that whole chapter as one unfolding story. It took extraordinary faith, amazing faith, for Paul and Silas and the team to get into that fragile wooden boat and set across the open seas in response to that vision. I mean, remember that this is not a cruise ship that they're getting on. This is a very fragile boat. Boat where there are all kinds of uncontrollable and terrifying experiences. You know, I see the kind of boats that refugees pack into across these same waters even today. And I think, what must it be that would make them get into that boat? Or into the boats that we see in the seas that gird our shores. I can't help but wonder, how desperate do you need to be before you get into that boat? Knowing how many other fragile boats have gone down, have been lost at sea, how many thousands of men and women and children have lost their lives. Yeah, I can barely imagine how terrifying that must be. And it must have been equally terrifying for Paul, because Paul knew shipwreck. We'll read about that later in Acts 27, the terrifying account of just one of Paul's shipwreck, just one. In Corinthians, he tells his Corinthian sisters and brothers that he went through not one shipwreck, but 3. After you've been in a shipwreck, what does it take to get in that boat again? And again. For those refugees, for those asylum seekers, it is desperation. But for Paul and his team, it would not have been desperation. It would have been faith that got them into that boat. Faith that God is leading them and God will not leave them on that journey. They get into that boat because Paul has this vision of a man crying out, "Come and help us," and they trust that God is going to use them to respond to that distress call, to that cry for help. Real faith gets them into that boat. Real faith that is stronger than real fear. As it turns out, they made it safely through this journey, and they arrived at Philippi, Macedonia. But there was no man there. There was no man there to greet them. There was a woman, Lydia, a faithful, courageous woman who generously welcomed not only Paul and Silas and the team, but welcomed the transforming message that they carried. That message of new life in Jesus Christ. Because of Lydia's welcome, a new church was planted in Philippi and established. And now all of that leads up to where we pick up the story in tonight's reading. Everything has gone pretty well up to this point. There have been great risks, but everything has gone pretty well. The church is established. Things are going well so far. And then everything goes pear-shaped. You see, the people in Philippi, they never had a problem with Lydia. And those God worshipers never had a problem with him so long as they stayed in their place of prayer. You go ahead and you do your churchy thing. You just stay in the place of prayer. We don't have any trouble with you. The problem came when Paul and his team arrived. And things changed in Philippi. Now it's not just people talking to God. Now God is speaking. And God is moving. God is acting. Through Paul, God has gone and freed a slave girl. He's gone and freed a slave girl from the spirit that has bound her and possessed her, which is all very well and good for the slave girl. But has anybody thought about the slave owners? Won't somebody please think of the slave owners? I mean, this is their livelihood. They count on this girl and her gifts to make their living. And now God, through Paul, frees her. And they are disturbed. The owners are disturbed that God is on the move. And they accuse Paul and the other Jesus followers of disturbing our city. This is the charge they bring. He's disturbing our city. He's disturbing our careful arrangements of the way the world works. And these people, they're advocating a whole new way of life. And so they are angry. They're angry, and most of all, they are scared. They are scared. If these blow-ins and their God can do so much to disturb the fundamental order of things in such a short period of time, what will happen next? What will happen if they get a foothold? Fear bursts from every page of this account in Acts. In their fear, the city authorities and the crowds, they are determined to silence these Jesus followers. And they haul Paul and Silas away from the place of prayer. And Luke tells us that the authorities and the crowds attack them and humiliate them. They strip their clothes off. And then with the kind of brutality that only fear can inspire, they beat Paul and Silas to a pulp with rods like baseball bats. And then they throw them, bruised and bloodied, into a filthy prison, silenced. Have you ever been gripped by fear? I don't mean have you ever felt fear. Everybody feels fear. Everybody. Have you ever been gripped, seized by fear? The difference between feeling fear and being gripped by fear, it isn't here and here. It's not measured in our adrenaline levels. It's measured in our actions, in the space between us and others, between us and the world. When fear grips us, it governs our actions. When fear grips us, it can drive us to flee, to run away, to find refuge in all sorts of things, in drugs, in alcohol, in power, in prestige, in gambling or sex, or anything else that can distract us even for a moment from our desperate fear. And at times, fear can freeze us. You know, when we know what we ought to do, when we know what we want to do, but we just can't take a step forward, we're petrified. We're frozen with fear. Or fear can drive us to fight. Fear fuels violence, whether it be in the home or in the streets or among nations. Fear is the fuel of hatred, of war, of violence. And there's another dimension to that fight reflex. Our fear can drive us to fight with God. You know, I think about a drowning victim. Somebody who's out at sea and they're drowning. Now, I understand that lifeguards are trained that if they swim out to somebody and somebody is thrashing and panicking, that their training is to tread water and wait. Because this drowning victim, in their panic, in their fear, they are going to fight, they're going to resist rescue. They're going to grab onto the lifeguard's hair. They're going to resist any sort of directions that the lifeguard gives to them if they're in that terror, that panic. And I think about our walk with God. I think about my walk with God. There have been times in my life when I have been flailing, trying to swim. You know, it's not because I'm stupid or because I'm evil. I know I am stupid, but it's not because I'm stupid. It's very funny. I said a little chuckle there. No, it's not because I'm stupid or because I'm evil that I'm fighting against God. It's because I'm scared. I'm so scared. And you know, my mind, if I could step outside of that situation, my mind would say, hey, you know what? I'm not doing very well swimming here. And here's somebody who's coming with a little orange and yellow beanie and some zinc on their nose. Maybe I ought to just let them handle this. But no, in my fear, in my terror, I thrash and I kick and I fight. And lifeguards are trained as to either wait for the person to thrash themselves out, or if they get an opportunity, to give them a boom, to stun them so that they can be brought into shore. And I thank God for, particularly for a time in my life when God saw an opportunity to get a little boom. Not as a punishment, but to bring me into shore. To put an end to my fighting of fear. To embrace me with grace and love. Maybe there's someone in this room tonight who's drowning out there. You're thrashing around and you're panicked that you're going down. But that hand is there. It's reaching to you, even in the midst of your fear. You know, when fear takes a hold of us, when it seizes us, it has the power to imprison us. A power that is stronger than heavy chains or iron bars. Fear has that power to imprison us, not from without, but from the inside. To imprison our spirit. Now, Paul and Silas, they had good reason to be afraid. They had very good reason to be afraid. After all that had just happened to them, they're sitting there in that innermost cell, in the darkest, coldest, stalest, foulest part of the prison. And they had good reason to be afraid, but now something is happening in the heart of the prison. They have every reason to be cowering in fear, but now something is happening in the heart of the prison. Something is happening inside those prison walls, something remarkable in the middle of the night. From that bleak misery of the core of the prison, Paul and Silas are singing. They're singing hymns. Their bodies are bruised from head to toe with wounds that are open and left unattended, open to the filth around them. Their legs are shackled with heavy chains and stocks, and their hopes to start a new church in Philippi, it looks like that is all crumbling around them. It seems like everything is dashed now, and yet out of the pitch darkness of their windowless cell, their voices rise in song. They're praying and singing hymns to God, and Luke tells us this very important piece. The other prisoners are listening. The other prisoners are listening. And that hope is overflowing from the song. That hope, that faith that speaks right into the heart of our fear. Remember what the crowds had done to Paul and Silas. What would it take for them to be singing hymns in that innermost cell? Imagine what the jailer must have been thinking. I mean, this jailer is grizzled. He's been watching prisoners for who knows how long. Imagine what he must have been thinking, because he knows he's been in this business long enough. He knows how prisoners are supposed to behave. And this is not how prisoners are supposed to behave. There's something wrong here. There's something going on in the heart of this prison. What's going on? What are Paul and Silas up to? If he was unsettled at their singing, he is terrified by what happens next. A massive earthquake shakes the prison to its foundations, and when the earthquake passes, the jailer gets up from under his table and he dusts himself off, and he sees that all the prison doors are open. And now he's truly terrified because he knows he's done. He's done. You remember what the crowd did, what the city authorities did to Paul and Silas? Well, what do you think that they're going to do to this jailer when it becomes known that he has let them all go, that the prisoners have escaped on his watch? He is so frightened in this moment that he draws his sword to kill himself. And in desperation, it seems that to take his own life is the best course for him. Rather than to face the wrath of the crowd that they will bring down on him, rather than to face the dishonor that he's going to, what will people think that he let all these prisoners go? He is ready to kill himself. And here is where we see who the real prisoner is in this story. It's not Paul. It's not Silas. It's the jailer. The jailer's chains are infinitely stronger than iron shackles. The jailer's chains are chains of fear. Overwhelmed by his fear, he stands on the brink of despair. Could it be that this jailer is the man of Macedonia in Paul's vision? Crying out, "Come and help." He's about to kill himself. In his desperate fear, he's about to kill himself. And somehow, Paul must be aware of the jailer's fear. And he cries out from his cell, "Don't harm yourself. Don't harm yourself. We're all still here. Don't be afraid. We're here with you. We haven't run off on you." Can you imagine being in Paul's place, in the cell, having been beaten, having lost all, having been left in the darkness, and then been through an earthquake, and now his concern is for the jailer? Don't be afraid. We're not going to leave you. And notice the transforming result of this conversion story that follows. One minute, the jailer is mortally terrified about what people are going to think, what people are going to do. He's so terrified that he is going to kill himself. And the next moment, the very next minute, he is absolutely unconcerned with what people think. He is absolutely unconcerned with what people are going to say. The jailer leads the prisoners out of the jail. He leads the prisoners out of the jail. And he opens up himself to the message that he heard in their prayers and in their hymns. He invites them to their home, to his home. He introduces them to his family. He binds up their wounds. He feeds them his food. And he becomes one of them. A Jesus follower. He is baptized. He's baptized. He puts on his whole trust. He puts his trust in Christ. It's not a superficial, safe, and comfortable trust. It's not, this will be a nice spiritual component to my otherwise busy life. No. It's not this will get me through the night kind of faith. This is something that will comfort me in times of trouble. No, this is a faith that faces fear head on. And he receives it, and he is baptized. He's seen what can happen to those who put their trust in Christ, and he knows that he's staking his life on this trust. But he is freed from the chains of his fear. The jailer knows that his lot is now with the disciples of Christ, and that's where he wants it to be. He has thrown his lot in with those apostles who just yesterday were attacked and beaten senseless and thrown into his prison. And in his baptism, he declares publicly, I'm with them. This passage from Acts 16, it echoes the account of Peter's being freed earlier in Acts 12, and it echoes and amplifies its message. Sisters and brothers, hear the message. If you're feeling gripped by fear tonight, hear the message. If fear is weaving its way into your life, hear the message. In Christ, God frees us from the chains that bind us. It's not a one-off experience reserved for Peter. It's for Paul, it's for Silas, and it is for the jailer, and it is for you. Very few of us will experience chains like those that bound Paul and Silas, but all of us know the chains that bound the jailer. All of us know fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of rejection and isolation, fear of shame and humiliation and pain, fear of failure, fear of falling down. Is there anybody who's not experienced this? Fear of making a mistake or of taking the wrong turn, fear of loss of people and things, fear of loss of control, even loss of life itself. The problem is not in our feeling of fear. Everyone feels fear. Even Jesus felt fear in the garden. It's in our action, in our response. The problem comes when our fears govern our actions, when our lives are ruled by our fears, not our faith. Fear can have an enormous power over us. It can control our lives without our conscious awareness, and it can hold us back from being the people that God calls us to be. Sometimes it's hard to see those chains. The jailer only recognized his chains when he called for light. Church, are we ready to call for light? Do we want to see our fears? Do we want to face our fears? The church ought to be a community where we, like the jailer, can find freedom from the fears that bind us. Too often, it seems that instead of praying for freedom, we pool our fears in the church. And we allow them to rule over us. For decades, the church across Europe and across North America and across Australia has been declining. We've seen that decline year after year, decade after decade. Our numbers have been in decline. Our resources diminish. Our place in society has been pushed to the margins across the whole church. There is this sense of decline, and across some of the church, there's a general malaise that sets in. A sense of inevitable loss, that this is all on a downward slope, and our best days are behind us. For us who love the church, that's a scary reality to face, which is why we go to such great lengths to try and avoid facing it. We exhibit all the signs of fear, don't we? We flee from the hard challenges. We freeze when we know what we're called to do, but we feel like we just can't step forward. And do we fight? Church. But here's the good news. In Christ, we are freed from the chains of our fears. That's not to say we won't fear, we will. But if we put our whole trust in the Lord, then our fears will no longer have power over us. In Christ, the chains of our fears fall off, and we are free. Our fear of the unknown cannot bind us because we put our trust in Christ, who knows all and knows us all. Our fear of rejection and isolation cannot bind us because we put our trust in Christ, who refuses to leave us alone. Our fear of shame and humiliation and pain cannot bind us because we put our trust in Christ, who has taken all of these upon himself. Our fear of failure, of taking a wrong turn, cannot bind us because we put our trust in Christ, who picks us up and sets us on the right path again. Our fear of loss, of people, of things, of control, even life itself cannot bind us because we put our trust in Christ, the reconciler of all creation, the Redeemer of the world. Sisters and brothers in Christ, out of our darkness, may we sing our hymn to God. My chains fell off. My heart was free. I rose, stepped forth, and followed thee.